Hi, everyone. This is Matt Offlick with the Office of Emergency Management. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give it another minute or two to see if we get some more folks on. If you see the slide that's up now, there's just some instruction there on how to get the closed captioning, if that's something you want. So you can go to the caption options at the bottom, turn the captions on, and then if you hit the little settings button, you can change the language. And we have 5 or 6 languages available for this. So just give us a couple minutes here and we'll get started. Hey everyone, this is Matt Offlick with the Office of Emergency Management. You can see there's some instructions here on how to turn on captions and change the language of captions. I think we kind of steadily still have people coming on, so I'm just going to give it another minute before we get started here. Thanks. Hi everyone, this is Matt Offlick. I'm the Community Relations Manager with the Office of Emergency Management. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is our first webinar in a series of webinars over the next few months. So first, I just wanted to cover a couple housekeeping things before we jump in. We're somewhat new to using Teams Live, so bear with us. We could have some technical difficulties as we move through, but hopefully not. Also on with me is Kate Hutton, our communications coordinator. So she's going to be assisting with some of the back end stuff. Thanks, Kate, including monitoring the Q&A function. So you should see an option for Q&A where you can input questions. You're welcome to input those questions as we move through the presentation. Depending on the question, Kate might just give you a private reply and reply to the question, or she might publish it to the group. If it's a question that we publish to the group, we'll hold those till the end. And once I'm through the presentation, then we'll answer all of those at this time. We will be recording the session and we'll post it to our YouTube channel. We should have that up by early next week, and that will include the captioning on the YouTube recording. I did add a meeting file, and that is a one-page list of resources. And so as I go through the presentation, sometimes I'll be talking about a specific plan or a specific preparedness resource, and I tried to be pretty thorough in what I included in that list. So if you have access to the meeting chat, you should see that there. Kate is also going to pretty soon here provide a link in the Q&A. So we'll try to get that to you in a couple of formats, but basically that's just a PDF that includes a series of hyperlinks to relevant documents that I'll reference during this. I think that's kind of it on the housekeeping side. Just first, I wanted to mention that we do have a series of webinars. So right now there are 4 additional webinars scheduled for June through September. So this is the first in that series. This session is really going to focus on describing at a very high level how the city will respond during a major earthquake and what implications that has for the public and your preparedness efforts. Future sessions will dive much more deeply into specific areas of response, and we'll have department representatives who are responsible for and can speak to those specific areas of response. So June 16th, we're going to focus more on fire and search and rescue response. July 20th, food and shelter. August 4th, restoring utilities, and September 1st, restoring transportation. So you can view all of those on our events calendar at seattle.gov/emergency and register there. All right. So with that, we will start jumping into the content. As I mentioned, this is really kind of the first in the series, and it's really meant to provide kind of an overarching look at how the city responds, but we also need to provide some context to that. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the region's earthquake risk. Then we're going to talk about what potential impacts are of a catastrophic earthquake. And then we'll kind of jump into that, understanding key elements of the city's earthquake response plans. And then also to provide some context for each area of response we talk about, I'll also kind of talk about how that links to personal preparedness. So the city is out there doing certain things in response. What does that mean for the community? What can the public do before and during an event to really help us as a city as a whole? And then one thing that I'm not going to specifically talk about, but that is very relevant to this conversation, is just the issue of preparedness and mitigation. So our ability to respond to a major earthquake is really going to be dictated by what the impacts are and what resources we have available. But our ability to kind of do mitigation work is really important. We're not going to talk about that here today, but in the list of resources that we'll provide under plans and relevant documents, the last link is to a document entitled Overview of Major City of Seattle Earthquake Preparedness Actions since 2001. So I would recommend you look at that, because that's really looking at all the work we've done to strengthen buildings, strengthen utilities and other infrastructure, strengthen bridges, and that's the work that's really going to be huge in decreasing the impacts we see, that so we can do more with the resources that we do have. So again, won't go into detail on it, but I would recommend checking out that document. All right, so jumping into it, just to talk a little bit about the earthquake risk. A lot of people may be familiar with this, but I think it's good to do an overview and then also talk about how this really does impact our response, the types of earthquakes. So we really have 3 main types of earthquakes that we experience in Seattle. Our worst case scenario is really a crustal or shallow quake. So a good example of that is the Seattle Fault, which basically runs from Bainbridge Island straight through downtown Seattle, or that area. And these are our worst case scenario because the fault is so close to the surface that the shaking is often going to be more violent, and the Seattle Fault is running right under some of our critical infrastructure right through the downtown core. So we could really see a lot more damage from an earthquake like that. We see those earthquakes less frequently, so that's a good thing. The last one we know of was in about 900 AD, but again, that would be our worst case scenario. When people talk about the big one, they're usually talking about the second type of earthquake, so a subduction zone earthquake or a megathrust quake. And this is the earthquake that's related to the Cascadia subduction zone. So where we have two tectonic plates coming together off the coast on the Pacific. And this is what can result in those 8.0, 9.0 earthquakes, those really big ones. Typically, we see an 8.0 or 9.0 every 250 to 500 years. The last one that we know we had was, a 9.0, and that was in the year 1700. So it's been quite a while. A lot of people you'll hear say that we're overdue. That's kind of not really an accurate description. As I said, 250 to 500 years on average, we see an 8.0 to a 9.0, but that's an average. So we come up with that number from looking at 40-something events over the last 10,000 years. Sometimes there's 100 years between events. Sometimes there's 500-600 years. So it's just an average, but we know we will have one at some point. Our most common type of earthquake is an intraplate or deep quake. So this is the one we're talking about on the far right there. You can see some numbers there on that graphic of deep quakes. The most recent one was 2001, so that was our Nisqually earthquake, but also had quakes in 49 and 65. So we typically see these every 50 years or so. They are typically going to be our least destructive because they're happening so deep beneath the surface. So typically we're looking at 30 kilometers or more below the surface where the earthquake is really emanating from. And so some of that can kind of dissipate as it moves toward the surface. So we're unlikely to see the type of damage we would see from a crustal or shallow quake. So when we talk about the earthquake types, and I'll talk about this in several spots as we move forward, this really does relate to how we respond. If we have that Seattle Fault earthquake, that shallow quake, it really is a worst case scenario because we're likely to have a lot more impacts. The one benefit would be that it would be somewhat of a localized event as compared to some of these other types of earthquakes. So we may be able to pull more resources from other jurisdictions in the region, from other parts of the state or nearby states. Where that differs, if we had a Cascadia subduction zone and it was a 9.0, a kind of full rip of that fault that you see there that really goes from British Columbia down to Northern California, it would likely be a regional event that was affecting all of those states along the coast. And so our ability to pull resources from other places would be limited. So different impacts, and one would likely leave us isolated where another might be more of a localized event. So what are the impacts from one of these earthquakes? Here's just some of the things to think about. When we talk about our response, when we talk about personal preparedness, it really goes back to all of these things. And the reality is that roads and bridges are going to be damaged, so getting around is going to be tough. Stores running out of supplies or just being closed because they aren't able to operate. I think COVID over the past year or so has hopefully opened people's eyes to that. That was a situation where we've even seen issues early on in the pandemic with stores running out of supplies, and a lot of that was kind of more based on demand of consumers than anything else. But hopefully it highlighted to people the importance of having things ahead of time in the case that stores are running out or not open. Utilities being damaged, so electricity, water, sewer, all these things that we're used to having kind of at the flip of a switch or turn of a handle won't necessarily be there. We're going to have damages. Gas stations, ATMs not working. Hospitals overwhelmed, so all of our communication systems, phones, cable TV, internet potentially not working, and first responders are going to be overwhelmed because we're going to have a lot more impacts than we can deal with the resources that we typically have on hand during a normal day. So just a little more on impacts. That map on the right is a map that was produced by an earthquake modeling software that we use called OneConcern. And this was a model that was run of the Cascadia scenario. So this is looking at a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake of a 9.0. Those red areas are areas of the city where that model at least predicts we would have heavy building damage, looking kind of at the block level. And we'd be looking at having thousands of buildings damaged, dozens to hundreds of deaths, hundreds to thousands of injuries, thousands of people in need of shelter, multiple fire ignitions with a risk that those could spread if they're not contained quickly. We would expect heavy transportation and infrastructure damage, so roads and bridges, and estimates of the overall dollar amount of damage being in the tens of billions. So they are significant impacts that we would expect from this. One thing to note on here, and I'll talk about the SHIVA a couple of times, our Seattle Hazard Identification and Vulnerability Analysis. If you see that red kind of pattern of where we expect the heaviest damage, a lot of that has to do with underlying soil conditions. So one of the resources listed on that one pager that we provided is the Seattle Hazard Explorer, and that's an interactive set of maps where you can go to learn a little bit more about hazards in the city and particular risks that exist for particular areas. And one of the tabs you'd see is liquefaction, and it goes into some more depth about soil conditions and fill soil and how that impacts ground shaking during an earthquake. But what you're seeing there, that pattern, is there's a lot of this parts of the city that were built on fill soil that were originally tidelands and were filled in with dirt, and so they're going to be more susceptible to shaking and likely experience more damage during an earthquake. But I'd recommend checking out the Hazard Explorer to learn more about that, or looking at the full Seattle Hazard Identification and Vulnerability Analysis. So as I mentioned, depending on the type of earthquake, we very well could be in an isolation phase. This map on the right is showing bridges in the state, and this was based on a regional resilience assessment in 2019 done by Department of Homeland Security and Washington State Emergency Management Division and Washington State Department of Transportation. And they were basically looking at impacts to bridges, potential impacts to bridges from a Cascadia earthquake that was a 9.0. And you can kind of see the legend there that those things that are the red and the dark red are looking at 1 to 2 years or greater than 2 years in terms of reopening time. Obviously, we have a lot of water, we have a lot of bridges in the region, and we expect that, especially in a Cascadia subduction zone, that we are going to be isolated for some time. And that's just that combination of geographic and infrastructure vulnerabilities.
Hey, Matt, really quickly, somebody asked if you could explain the colors on the map with the legend.
Yeah, so they were looking at projected reopening time for each of these bridges, and the link to the report to this is in that resource list, so you can get a lot more detailed information, including the lists of all of those bridges. But basically, you can see the gray is they expect it to be undamaged. There are very few gray dots on there. The dark green dots, they expect that it could reopen in less than a month, and then it goes on from there. So the darkest red are ones that they expect to have a level of damage to that bridge that it would not reopen for more than 2 years. So as you can see, there's a lot of red on the map. So when we talk about, especially if we had that 9.0 earthquake, we're not talking about transportation disruption for days. We're potentially talking about for years and needing to have interim solutions to get around. And we'll talk about kind of this long-term recovery and what that looks like a couple times. So just real quick, I just wanted to highlight some of the key documents here. There is a lot of content here, and that's why this session is really an overview. There's more content and more areas of response and more capabilities than we can really speak to in an hour or 2 hours or 4 hours. So that's why we're providing those additional kind of webinars to really dive deeper. But I did want to point people to these things because they are things that are on our website. I've put them all in the one-page sheet so you can access them. At the most basic level, we have our comprehensive emergency management plan. So this is really an all hazards plan. So it's meant to kind of guide us in responding to any type of incident. And it's really outlining how we organize and how we prepare for, prevent, mitigate, respond to, and recover from really any emergency. So it's kind of that high level, this is how we organize, these are the responsibilities kind of across the city, and this is our overall kind of vision for response. And then underneath that are a number of plans that kind of exist within the SEM. One of the core things that exists within the SEM is the Seattle Hazard Identification and Vulnerability Analysis that I mentioned. So that is basically a document that looks at what are all the things that could happen in the city, including kind of a deep look at earthquakes, but a number of other things. And really looking at what the impacts of those would be. And that's a pretty detailed document. I mean, it's about 300 pages long. So as I mentioned, there's the Seattle Hazard Explorer, which is kind of a more interactive way to get a quick look at all of that data, and interactive maps where you can search addresses and scroll around maps. If you want a lot more detail, then you could look at the whole hazard identification and vulnerability analysis. So the other thing is the earthquake annex. So the earthquake annex is part of the comprehensive emergency management plan. And this is just a little more detailed look at earthquakes specifically, and we're going to talk about some elements of this. A big part of that is assumptions. What do we expect to happen during an earthquake? And then really outlining what are the responsibilities of the various departments and what are the systems that we're going to use to kind of coordinate across the city and prioritize. Other things that are relevant are department continuity of operations plans. So obviously, as a city government, we provide a lot of services to the community. And so individual departments do have plans in place for how they will keep those services going. I think a good example is us here at the Office of Emergency Management. So our core function, really, especially during a disaster, is providing citywide coordination. So being the office that brings all of those departments together and helps develop those plans of action so that we are all responding according to the impacts that we're seeing and using all resources possible and all really working toward the same end goals. We do that out of our city's Emergency Operations Center, which is downtown at the corner of 5th and Washington. But we know that the city may not be available to us for a number of reasons, especially during an earthquake. So as part of our continuity of operations plan, we've identified alternate sites. So we have sites like North Seattle College and the Gates Foundation and the University of Washington, so that we have other spaces we could go to that we've tested, that we've exercised in, that we know we could do the work we need to do out of those. So those are the types of things that people deal with in their continuity of operations plans, how they can adjust facilities and staff and other resources so that we can keep providing the service that we need to provide. And then the last thing I reference is the recovery framework. So I'll mention this kind of at the end here, and we'll talk about it a couple of times, but that really is looking at how we recover. So outside of this response phase, there's going to be a lot of work in recovering, especially from a catastrophic earthquake. If you look at incidents like Hurricane Katrina in 2005, there's still recovery work going on in New Orleans. If we have a catastrophic earthquake, that is going to be something that we're recovering from for decades, really. And the recovery framework helps outline kind of some of those considerations for recovery, and also organization of recovery, how we put a structure in place to guide recovery. And some of that was used to kind of develop the structure that we're using now for COVID recovery. So it's actually being used, not just on paper. All right, so one of the first things that you'll find in the earthquake annex, and there are dozens of these listed, but I just pulled some out, are planning assumptions. So when we start looking at how we'll respond to something, we like to get down, what do we think the state of things will be when this event happens? And these are just some of the key ones, and I think these are the ones that most speak to the aspects of response that I'm going to talk about here in a minute. There are not enough public safety resources in the city to immediately address all or even a majority of the life safety needs that we would have after a severe earthquake. So I think a good example is the Ballard fire that we had in 2019 that took out kind of a strip of businesses in Ballard. That was in the middle of a weekday that fire happened. And that was a single fire, although it was, a series of buildings that were on fire. That took 65% of all Seattle fire resources. So our city government and our emergency response is really built to deal with day-to-day issues. If we have an event that makes those issues tenfold or 100-fold, we just don't have the resources to deal with that. Staffing in most city departments varies depending on time of day, and in a large earthquake, especially if we're at a time when there's the lowest levels of staffing, we would really be impaired in terms of getting people in to be able to do the work that needs to be done. There are over 13,000 city employees, and just to give you an idea, less than 40% of those employees live within the city of Seattle. So getting people in to start doing work could be a serious issue. Initial shelters may be spontaneous, non-traditional, and rudimentary. So the city will be working, and we'll talk a little bit about this, to stand up sheltering. But right when something happens, if there's a need for sheltering, it's likely going to be very spontaneous. And we expect organizations throughout the city to stand up and start taking people in and putting things in place while we get some more official things up and running. Other things, the city is going to quickly need to incorporate outside personnel. And like I said, that's going to be really difficult in an event that isolates us. But it's something that we're going to need to do eventually because we just don't have those resources internally to deal with the scope. The 911 system, if operating, will be overloaded. So we could have actual infrastructure fail where the system's not working. At the very least, we expect the call volume to be so high that the system will not be able to operate. People will not be able to get through. And then another key one is the city does not stockpile food or water for the general public. So this is kind of in line with that sheltering one. I mean, we just don't have the capacity to keep extra food on hand for an event like this. So that's where kind of feeding operations will also take time to get up. And that's also where it just ties into kind of personal preparedness guidance as well. So just at the highest level, when we talk about earthquake response and really the citywide response, and you'll find this outlined in our comprehensive emergency management plan, but also in the earthquake annex. When we look at citywide response priorities, these are the 4 things we look at, and it really is in this order. Number 1 absolutely is life safety. So our number 1 priority is saving lives. That is it. Number 2 is incident stabilization. So, you know, post-earthquake, there will be collapsed buildings, there will be fires. We want to first protect lives, but then we really need to mitigate those situations. We need to put out the fire. We need to stabilize infrastructure so the situation doesn't get worse. Those are really the first 2 things, and those really both go toward protecting life safety. Next is property conservation. Obviously, recovery is going to be tough. We want to protect as much property as we possibly can. And then environmental protection. We want to make sure that we're protecting the environment. But at the end of the day, life safety is going to kind of win out over environmental protection. I think a good example of where these priorities may compete is something like winter storm response. If you talk to SDOT, you know, they can give you scenarios where we've had huge snow events, and the number 1 priority is getting snow off streets so we can keep emergency response going. So ambulances can get to people, fire trucks can get to people, and we can get people to hospitals. So we need to get rid of that snow. Sometimes there's so much snow that we have to go with the option of actually starting to dump snow into Puget Sound. There are environmental impacts of that and even fines that we can get from that. But if given the choice of not being able to remove snow from streets and not having emergency services access, not having access to hospitals, and endangering the environment, then, you know, we go with the life safety and we do what we need to do so that we can continue to prioritize life safety. So these are kind of really high level priorities. If you're to look at the earthquake annex, you would find a series of response goals that go a little more in depth, and there's 6 of those. And again, life safety is number 1. The number 1 goal is rescuing and protecting the greatest number of people. Also provide for the safety of responders and other city employees. Saving and protecting as much critical infrastructure as possible, saving and protecting as many residential, business, and industrial properties as possible, stopping the spread of environmental damage, and then minimizing human hardship. So how do we stand up that sheltering, feeding, healthcare, and minimizing economic disruption? So those are kind of these broad goals that we start with, but obviously everything ultimately is going to be influenced by what the actual impacts are that we see during that event. So I'm going to jump into a little more kind of meat of what a response looks like, and I'm going to organize it into kind of 3 phases. Now, these are very generic. These are no way set in stone. The timelines that I'm giving here are very general and very flexible, and it's unlikely that we would ever be doing any one of these by itself. All 3 of these phases are really going to be overlapping. And then all of them are also going to overlap with that more long-term recovery effort that I discussed that could take years, but will probably begin in the weeks and months after the event. So in the hours and days, we're talking about immediate response, which we'll talk about first. In the hours to weeks after the event, we're talking about initial situation and damage assessment. And in the days to months, we're talking about stabilizing essential community lifelines, so that sheltering, feeding, utility restoration side of things. So the first is immediate response. So as I mentioned, that is hours to days. The second the earthquake happens, we are out there trying to save lives. That is the #1 priority. So we're looking at emergency response, so that search and rescue, firefighting, emergency medical care. How are we getting people access to hospitals? What is the status of hospitals? How we can make sure that hospitals are still up and running. Also, public information. So one of the immediate response things is getting information out to the public. There's going to be information that we need to get to the public about what the situation is and what we need people to do to stay safe and help those around them. And then the fourth thing is establishing citywide coordination. So all of the work we do after that immediate response is really going to be influenced by how we can assess the situation across the city and then put our resources to best use throughout the city. So key departments in this are fire, police, emergency management, public utilities, city light, and I should have put SDOT there too. I'd say Seattle Department of Transportation, because access to places is big. We'll talk about that in the last phase as well, but they definitely have an immediate response as well. So first, on the public safety side, I think this aspect is really good for people to know about. In terms of immediate response, so the earthquake happens, one of the initial things that happens and is extremely important is a windshield survey process that happens with the Seattle Fire Department and the Seattle Police Department. So on the right, you're just seeing an example map of one of the life safety damage assessment routes that the Seattle Fire Department has. So basically, earthquake happens, each fire station has a designated damage assessment route that they get in their vehicles, and they do. I think for the public, the thing to know is that you should not be surprised if after the earthquake you see a fire truck going by you, even if your single family house is on fire or you have an emergency happening right then and there. The first thing that they need to do is really identify what the most critical needs are, so that we can then allocate resources to those needs. So as I mentioned, there's not going to be enough resources in the city to adequately respond. So the first thing that they're going to do is drive these routes, and the focus is on critical facilities first. So hospitals, public safety facilities, utilities, those are things that they're going to look on that route. High occupancy buildings, so high rises, other office buildings, places where there are likely a lot of people. And this may depend on the time of day, and they're going to adjust accordingly. If it's 2 in the morning, then the high rise office building may not be as high a priority as if it's noon on a Wednesday. Buildings housing vulnerable populations, so schools, nursing homes, things like that. Transportation infrastructure, so roads, key bridges. And these routes that they go, while they have them mapped out, they're also going to be dictated by what is accessible, and they're going to adjust as they need to. And then they're going to be looking for major utility disruptions. So again, the point is for them to do a quick cursory damage assessment of buildings and infrastructure, so that they can then move their resources to those things, those incidents where they can save the greatest number of lives. So the classic example is, if we have a school building in the middle of a day on a Wednesday and there's a collapse or a partial collapse, and a few blocks away there's a single family house on fire, they're going to move their resources to those places where they can save the greatest number of lives, so that collapsed building. And that's really the point of this. And then the other thing to keep in mind is they may stop dispatching 911 calls. We talked about 911 being disrupted. It may just be there's an overflow of calls, or there's actually some infrastructure problem. But if they have to stop dispatching 911 calls, this is really what they're going to use, kind of at the station level and at the battalion level. What are they seeing out there? What are they hearing from police department and other city resources of what they're seeing out there? And then based on what they know is happening out there, move their resources to where they can save the greatest number of lives. So another part of immediate response is public information, which I mentioned. There's a couple parts to this, but I'm really going to talk about right when the earthquake happens. What does that look like? You may have heard, and if you haven't, this is something I put a link to in the one-pager sheet. We now have earthquake early warning active in Washington State, and it went live on May 4th. So right now, the primary way to deliver messages is through wireless emergency alerts. And so if you've ever gotten an Amber Alert, it's essentially using that same technology to push this alert to your phone. So this is not something you have to sign up for. But as long as your phone has wireless emergency alerts enabled, which by default they normally do, then you will get the alert showing up on your phone. The link that I provided goes to Washington State Emergency Management Division's info on earthquake early warning, and they do have some resources in there about how to make sure that this is turned on your phone. And I would just stay tuned to OEM's calendar and other things that we have going out, because we'll probably do more sessions on this in the future. Things to know: earthquake early warning is not earthquake prediction. So this is actually going out after the earthquake happens. And the amount of time that you will get in that warning is really going to be dictated by where the earthquake is. So if we have a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake that happens, 100 miles off the Washington coast and we're in Seattle, then we very well could get warning from that, because it's far enough away that the sensors can sense the initial shaking near the source of the earthquake and push information to us before we actually get those secondary waves that are felt. You will not always get an alert, so it's going to depend on the magnitude and the location of the earthquake. But in an event that we do get an earthquake early warning, this is likely going to be the first piece of information you get, because you could get it before the shaking even starts. So other elements of public information. Oh, sorry, this right here is a example of what you would actually see. So if shaking from an earthquake is expected at your location, this is what the message will say. This is really the extent of what you're going to get. And the point of this is back to that life safety. If you can even have 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds to put yourself in a safe position during an earthquake, that can go a really long way. So the point is really to tell you this is going to happen, shaking is going to happen, drop, cover, hold on. If you're in an unsafe place, hopefully you can get to a safe place. There's other things that this will be used for, which is really linking to infrastructure and things like that. So the ability to know shaking is going to start and shut down bridges, hospitals shutting down systems, stopping surgeries, things like that. Those are other things that can kind of happen on the back end, train stopping. So, using it to put infrastructure in a better kind of situation to deal with the impacts as well. The wireless emergency alert system can send messages in English and Spanish only. So you see there what you would get in Spanish as well as English, but the system only has the ability to send in those 2 languages. So other public information things, I'll talk about the role of the Emergency Operations Center in a minute. But one part of the Emergency Operations Center is our Joint Information Center. So when we do activate our Emergency Operations Center, we stand up our Joint Information Center, and that is the space where public information officers from throughout the city will be working to collect what is all of that relevant public information and push it out through media and any other way we can, so people know what is going on, what the situation is, and what actions they should take. The first thing, however, would probably be a somewhat generic alert. So like I said, the earthquake early warning is really just going to be an earthquake is going to happen, or an earthquake is happening right now. And then the follow-up message would really be pretty generic. And the way we would do this is the Office of Emergency Management would send out a message via Alert Seattle at the very least. And potentially a wireless emergency alert as well. So again, that alert that you don't need to sign up for, but just goes to your phone. And because right after the earthquake happens, we are not going to have a lot of information about what the impacts are out there. We're just going to be able to provide some very basic messaging that would apply to any earthquake situation. So asking people to limit travel on roadways, prepare for aftershocks, not use the phone system. We mentioned that 911 could be overwhelmed, so encouraging people not to get on the phone if you don't need to, so important calls can get through, telling people to prepare to be without power, and then encouraging people to help those around them and help their neighbors, which we'll talk about a couple times throughout this. So the other part of immediate response is really establishing citywide coordination. And the way we do that is through activating the Emergency Operations Center. So like I mentioned, our Emergency Operations Center is at the corner of 5th and Washington downtown. We have alternate locations if for some reason we could not activate this. We have internal processes for alerting city staff and partner agencies that we are activating and giving them instructions to report. During COVID, we've had to shift largely to a virtual activation. And so, we continue to do that as there's COVID impacts, but hopefully soon we're back to using our normal Emergency Operations Center space. But managing the consequences of the disaster is really what we're doing in the EOC. So things that we do here is coordinate information. We take that information and use it to develop plans of action. We coordinate resources. So that would mean coordinating resources both at the city level, but this is really where we're putting those requests in to get resources from the county, from the state, from FEMA, and then also making policy decisions. So just one of the ways we start to stabilize the incident and we give ourselves the ability to really move beyond that immediate response phase is to establish this coordination across the city, but also with other levels of government. And we really serve as that central point of coordination. So by coordinating out of one central location and using a unified process, we can start to understand what are the impacts out there, where is the most need, and then make some centralized decisions about where we need to put resources so we can start solving those problems that exist out there. Another planning assumption that's listed in our earthquake annex that is very relevant here. It states that a detailed and credible common operating picture may not be achievable for 24 to 48 hours or longer after the earthquake. So when we think back to those fire department damage assessment routes, it's very likely that in those initial hours, it is, what do you see? Go deal with it. It's going to take some time before we can really get that citywide picture, but that's why we activate, so we can start getting that picture, so we can then inform those people that are out there responding to really put resources to where they're needed most. So what does this mean for the general public? Just a couple of things that I think are worth highlighting. Before something happens, I think learning life safety skills is incredibly important. We talked about resources are going to be overwhelmed. The fire truck may go past the single house that's on fire because there's bigger problems to deal with. So having certain skills so you can help address the problems at your home and help neighbors address problems, help people on the block address problems. So learning how to use a fire extinguisher, how to turn off natural gas and when to turn off natural gas, bleeding control, search and rescue. So these are all things that we give classes on. We've been on hiatus due to COVID in terms of in-person classes, but I did put the link to our YouTube channel under the preparedness resources, and we do have videos on most of these things. And then we hope potentially late 2021, but at the very latest, hopefully we're in early 2022 that we're again giving those in-person classes. So I can't recommend that enough, that come out and get hands-on instruction on how to use a fire extinguisher, how do you turn off natural gas, how do you put on a tourniquet or pack a wound, how do you safely lift someone up or pull someone out of a situation in a search and rescue class. And it's really going to be key that people are helping themselves and helping people around them while resources are overwhelmed. And then the other thing is organizing with neighbors, and this is along those same lines. So we have our SNAP program, Seattle Neighborhoods Actively Prepare. And then there's the Community Emergency Hub program in the city. So SNAP is our program that really focuses on talking to people that live on the same block, live in the same apartment building, and giving them tools and resources for how they can organize together so that they can respond in their building, respond in their block, put out fires, take care of natural gas, first aid, those types of things. So again, with the goal of help each other while firefighters and police are out dealing with the biggest problems that exist. Community emergency hubs, if you're not familiar, there's also a link to the hub site in the list that was provided. There's about 130 hub locations throughout the city, and the purpose of a community emergency hub is really to serve as a place in a neighborhood where community can come together to start sharing information and sharing resources. So responders are overwhelmed, communication's down, transportation's down, there are needs in the neighborhood. Come here so people can start helping each other. It's really a place that can kind of jumpstart that neighbors helping neighbors process. There are potentially amateur radio operators at hub sites, and they could also serve as kind of a communication point for the city. So if radio is not working, or I mean like regular AM, FM radio or TV or internet, those ways we're traditionally pushing out information or getting information, then we may be able to share information through hub sites, and we may use that as a way to get information about what are those impacts out there as we try to kind of piece together what's going on in the city. In terms of during the event, so we're talking about that immediate response, things just happen. One is knowing to drop, cover, and hold. So an earthquake happens, get under something sturdy. Most injuries in the US from earthquakes are caused by falling objects. Stay off the phone if possible, back to that 911. We want people to be able to get through. And only call 911 if you have a true life safety emergency. So it's really immediate, protect yourself by drop, covering, hold, help anyone you can, and if possible, stay off the phone unless you have a true life safety emergency that you would need to get through to 911. So that brings us to the next phase. So initial situation and damage assessment. As I mentioned, this is a tough process, especially at the beginning of a catastrophic earthquake. It will start happening immediately, but it will likely take a long time. So our time frame is really hours to weeks. And we're talking about assessing damage, but also using that assessment of damage to help develop plans of action. So we're pulling that information into the Emergency Operations Center, using it to develop plans so we can prioritize where resources are going, but then also using that information to determine what outside resources we need. So we can start putting in those requests through our logistics unit to ask the county, ask the state, ultimately ask the federal government for what we need so we can bring in outside resources. A lot of departments involved in this, probably every department, but some of the key ones are our finance and administrative services because they really head our logistics unit, public utilities, city light, parks and rec, transportation, information technology, construction and inspections. And a lot of those other departments because they're really responsible for assessing infrastructure and assessing other city property that we have. So just some things to highlight in terms of damage assessment. It's first going to focus on critical facilities and infrastructure. So, we need to make sure that shelter locations can open. We need to make sure that hospitals can be, that people can be in hospitals and those buildings are safe, public safety facilities, other critical infrastructure. So that's really where we're starting. We're going to collect information from a lot of different sources. City departments are going to be out there, but we're also going to be looking at information from the public, from businesses, from community organizations, from individuals. And this will kind of evolve over a period of time. Like I said, we can immediately have some city resources out there prioritizing what they're assessing, but ultimately we're going to be looking for information from lots of different sources, and we'll talk about that a little more here in a minute. And then it's really taking that information to develop plans of action. So in our Emergency Operations Center, we have something called a Consolidated Action Plan. And we have a process for developing that. And we develop one for each operational period, which we're usually looking at 12 to 24 hours. So every 24 hours at least, we are reassessing what information we have, using that to develop a set of priorities and objectives and having those assigned out to individual departments. And then we are doing it all over again. We are going to implement that. And then for the next 24 hours, based on what we accomplished and what we've learned, we are going to develop a new plan and implement that for the next 24 hours. So it's this kind of ongoing cycle of assess the situation, assess progress we've made, assess ongoing impacts, use that to develop plans of action and put resources out there to deal with them, and then reassess and plan again. And then the next part of that is, and really going on at the same time, is looking for outside assistance. And the situation and damage assessment is pretty key in this, especially for this first one. So where are we getting outside assistance? Like I said, in a Cascadia subduction zone event that is going to be regional, we're most likely looking outside of the region. And by region in that case, I mean the Pacific Northwest. So we're likely going to need to look for things outside of Washington, Oregon, Northern California. In a localized event, we have a lot of agreements with neighboring jurisdictions where we can pull firefighters from Bellevue or Shoreline or other places like that, but that's likely to not be relevant in this earthquake scenario. So the big one is federal assistance. So there is a presidential declaration process. We would be looking to, and in all likelihood, would get a presidential declaration, which once that is in place, that means that we can get a lot of federal resources that we would not normally get in terms of both individual assistance for people in the public that have been impacted, but also for public things like infrastructure. Part of that is a damage assessment. Before a declaration can be made, we need to collect so much information showing that the impact is to a certain level that state and local resources can't handle it and that we need additional resources. The big one that I think a lot of people don't know about is state-to-state assistance, and a lot of assistance that comes in during catastrophic events really does come from other states. So Washington State is part of the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which is agreement amongst all 50 states. And that's where we can put a specific ask out through our Washington State Emergency Management Division, which they can then put out to all of the other states that participate in this program, and we can directly bring in resources from those states. So if you think about things like building inspectors, utility workers, utility restoration equipment, that stuff is usually coming in through other states or local jurisdictions that are within these other states and have an agreement with the state. That actual equipment stuff, less so is coming from the federal government, more from states. But we start, again, using all that information that's coming in. What are the needs? What do we have? What do we need? Start requesting it from the outside. So in this initial situation and damage assessment phase, what does this mean for the public? A couple of things to highlight. I think, I talked about in terms of doing damage assessment, for the city and city building inspectors, the focus is really on critical facilities, and there are about 100 building inspectors in the city. We talked about having thousands of damaged buildings. It is going to take a long time before they get to individual residential structures. So look into retrofitting your home. There's a link in the resources to information on home retrofit. If you have a single family home, there's a lot of tools in the city to learn about how to assess your home to see if it needs to be retrofitted. And we do offer a home retrofit class where we have some contractors who go over that process, how to assess your home, how to potentially do the work yourself, but also things to consider if you're going to hire someone to do the work. Also a hiatus on those classes, but hope to resume in 2022. And there are a lot of good resources on the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspection site. The other thing is have earthquake insurance. When I talked about requesting federal assistance, we could get a presidential disaster declaration. We could get individual assistance with that, but that is very limited. If we were to get individual assistance, the maximum assistance that any individual could get is $35,000. So if you had a total loss of your home and you had no earthquake insurance, you potentially could get $35,000, but that would be the most. Obviously, that's not going to go very far if you're replacing a home in Seattle. So having an earthquake insurance on top of retrofitting your home is a good practice. And that $35,000 is best case scenario. During Hurricane Harvey a few years ago, the average payout in individual assistance was closer to $5,000. Also have renter insurance. If you're not a homeowner, but you are a renter, having renter's insurance, so at the very least you could potentially recoup the costs of lost personal property, maybe have some funds for relocation, a new security deposit, things like that. And then know where your local emergency hub is located. So like I said, it's going to be tough to communicate, potentially communications disrupted. We're still going to be looking to get information about what's going on out there. We're still going to be pushing out information about what's going on. So know where the hub that's closest to you is located, because that's likely to be a source for you to go to get information about what's going on, help other people. While the incident is going on, you're going to want to look for public information on reporting damages. So if we have a process for how to report damages, we'll be pushing information out on that. But in the worst case scenario where there is nothing, you can potentially go to the hub to give and get help, but also to report information on damages impacts in your community. So hopefully they can get fed into our emergency operations center. We can incorporate that into those plans of action that we're developing and assessing impacts. So the last phase that I'm going to talk about is stabilizing essential community lifelines. There is a lot to this, and again, this is a very cursory overview of this. I highly recommend that you attend our future webinars because we will have one specifically on transportation. We'll have one specifically on restoring electricity and water service, and we will have one on food and shelter. So the time frame we're looking really is weeks to months. Obviously, we're going to start doing this work immediately, but it's probably weeks before we can really make a dent in it. And the priority is stabilizing transportation, restoring power, restoring water, and providing food and shelter. The key departments are public utilities, city light, parks and recreation, and human services. And when we talk about sheltering, you'll see that parks and recreation has a role because of our use of community centers potentially in providing shelter. But these are really the priorities we're looking at. I think something to highlight here is when we say stabilize essential community lifelines, we are not looking at restoring things to a pre-earthquake state in those days to months after. We are talking about restoring things to some basic level of service that will allow the community to meet their basic needs and help us allow the community to meet their basic needs. We are not talking about everything is back to normal. So if you remember back to that map that was looking at the isolation phase and showing potential restoration times for bridges, some of those were in the years. Somewhere we look to a lot is Christchurch, New Zealand. So they had a series of earthquakes in 2010, 2011. They have a similar built environment to us. They have a similar earthquake risk to us. So we really look to them for a lot of lessons learned. And that's a good example of kind of how long recovery can take. So in their earthquakes that they had in 2011, 40% of sewer lines were damaged. And to this day, they are still not back to pre-earthquake levels of sewer service. There is still recovery going on. So we're talking about kind of a long haul. So this should sound familiar kind of with other things we talked about, but when we're talking about transportation, we're really going to be prioritizing access for emergency response and to hospitals initially. That is going to be the first thing. If you tune into our transportation webinar, you can get some more details from SDOT about, they have bridge inspection teams, they have processes for how people report and start inspecting bridges. Bridges will be a priority, but the overarching priority is really how do we ensure that there's access for emergency response and how do we ensure there's access to hospitals? And then starting to look at routes to establish access to other essential services. So if we're standing up shelters, can we make sure that people can access shelters? If we're standing up food distribution sites, how do we make sure people can get to those? So it's some basic level of service. Similarly with power, it's really focusing first on critical facilities. So shelters, hospitals, public safety facilities, that's where we're really going to be looking to reestablishing power. And then water, you'll see I use the term wet water. That's because that's what we have in documentation. We're talking about really potable water, so drinkable water. The first priority absolutely is water for fire suppression, and we expect that Seattle Public Utilities will need to use a lot of resources to assist the fire department in getting access to water. So that's the #1 priority. How do we get water to fire trucks, to firefighters, so they can use it for fire suppression? The next priority is what we said there, wet water, which is not necessarily potable water. It is just water. And that is getting some water to critical customers. So we're talking about those shelters, we're talking about healthcare institutions. And the goal here is to get water out. We may not be able to ensure that water is clean and potable water, but that's where we're going to be putting out information about the need to boil water or treat water before using. And then the next priority is that wet water, not necessarily potable water, to maximum population benefit. So how can we start getting some level of water service out to the broader community? Not necessarily potable water that you can take right out of the faucet and drink. We may need to have messaging about the need to boil water, to disinfect water some other way, but at least getting water out there so it is there. And then the last priority is really that potable water. So ultimately, we want to get to where everyone has access to drinkable water, but we know there's going to be phases in getting to that. And then food and shelter. So in a catastrophic situation, it will likely take days to establish shelters. In a catastrophic situation, a sheltering strategy is likely going to be regional, and it's not just going to be city spaces or city resources. It's going to really need to incorporate community organizations and various levels of government. And initial shelters likely will not have significant food and supplies. So I kind of mentioned that in the planning assumptions. It will likely be rudimentary in the initial days, which is this is a roof for people to have over their heads, and then it will progress from there. Some things to note here, there's some primary city-owned shelter facilities, and those are community centers. I also have a link in that list of documents to our shelter annex where there's a lot more detail on this, and that really breaks down the fact that we're looking at a lot of different spaces. So we partner with the American Red Cross. They would be someone we'd be looking to, as they have a number of shelter facilities located in, churches, schools, other places throughout the city, depending on what's available. We may use some of those, and we may use some city-owned facilities. The issue with standing things up immediately is a few things. I mentioned availability of staff because people are kind of everywhere, so you have to get people in, but you also have to assess facilities and make sure they're habitable before you use them. So this is why we have potential spaces outlined, but we don't necessarily tell people this is your shelter location, because we don't know if that shelter location will actually be available. Will it have power? Will it be structurally sound? We do have caches of shelter supplies in 4 separate places in the city, so kind of distributed north, south, east, west. So there's one cache in Magnolia, one in North Seattle, one in central southeast Seattle, and one in West Seattle. And all combined, that has supplies to basically shelter 3,500 people. So that includes cots, blankets, and there's some other things like toiletry kits and things like that. So there's some basic level of service when we stand something up. So just a little bit on the city-run facilities. And again, these are just kind of facilities we have that we could use. It's really going to depend on the situation, but we have them broken down into priority. So priority 1 locations are Rainier Beach Community Center, Southwest Teen Center, Queen Anne Community Center, Garfield Community Center, Bitter Lake Community Center, and Meadowbrook Community Center. The intent is to spread these out throughout the city, and they're priority 1 because they have backup generators and because they're located adjacent to public schools. So potentially we could use both places and have kind of more of a concept, campus concept, where we could shelter up to 1,000 people at each location. So that's why they're priority 1, because we have them spread out throughout the city, adjacent to a public school, which gives us more space potentially, and they have backup power. There's also priority 2 city-owned facilities. So these are Jefferson, Delridge, and Magnuson community centers. These don't have that benefit of being adjacent to a school, but they do have backup generators. So, we may be able to ensure that we have power there at least, which is something we're going to want to start bringing people in. So like I said, that was kind of cursory overview of that stabilizing essential lifelines. And I think the key here is just knowing that stabilizing essential lifelines, again, is not pre-earthquake levels of service, but it's some basic level of service so people have what they need. What does this mean for the public? Storing extra water and food. Like I said, we saw this even during COVID, but even more important in a catastrophic earthquake, do you have the basic things so you can at least be self-sufficient for a week or two? So having extra water stored, having food stored. Do you have plans to power essentials? This is especially important if you rely on electricity for medical equipment. So do you have plans in place if there is no electricity? This is something City Light will probably speak more to in our restoring utilities. There are ways that people that are relying on electricity for medical equipment can get on lists with City Light. This doesn't ensure that you'll have power restored faster, but it at least documents that you have the need. And then the one that we've had on every phase is knowing where your local emergency hub is located. So again, we're really looking for people to rely on those around them, help those around them. Historically, this is what you see happen in catastrophic incidents. People start doing that naturally. Hubs is a way to kind of jumpstart that process. And then during the event, start looking for information on the availability of food, water, shelter, and other services, and go to your emergency hub. So know where it is beforehand, because you may not be able to look it up at the time. And if we can't be pushing things out through traditional media and communication methods, then potentially we can get that information to emergency hubs through amateur radio or other means. So you can go there to figure out what services are available to you. So just real quick, wanted to highlight this transition to recovery piece. You know, we were just talking about that immediate response up through maybe months. And so here you see that kind of preparedness before the disaster, short-term, intermediate, long-term. When we're talking about long-term recovery, we're really talking about years. Our goals immediately are save as many lives as we can, start to understand what those impacts are, allocate resources so we can best deal with those impacts. But long term, there's going to be a lot of work. And I mentioned Hurricane Katrina as recovery that's been going on for decades. I mentioned Christchurch, New Zealand as somewhere where recovery has been going on for a decade now. And in a catastrophic earthquake, that's what we're looking at. And like I said, I did put the link to the recovery framework in that resource list. And that's something you could look at for more details on this. Some of the things that are key to look at in that and kind of themes that you'll see throughout are building back better is a big theme. You know, if we are in a situation where large parts of our city have been destroyed, then it's really an opportunity to build back better and address any inequities and gaps that existed before the event. So that's something that's really weaved throughout the recovery framework of how do we keep that concept of building back better in mind. And then participation and community input is a big part of that. So as we start to make those decisions about what recovery looks like, how do we make sure that community is at the table so that everyone has a voice in what that recovery looks like and what those priorities are? I think those are the two main themes you would see in that recovery framework. And again, that is a very long process that would go on for years. So this was our initial webinar and kind of that overview of what city response looks like. Hopefully those three kind of phases of the immediate response, the situation and damage assessment, and the stabilizing community lifelines gives you an idea of kind of those areas of response, how they overlap, and how we start to prioritize. These future webinars are really going to be a much deeper dive into some of those areas that we see as the core areas. Like I said, fire and search and rescue, food and shelter, restoring utilities, and restoring transportation. I can take questions now, and something else to think about is if there's areas that people think aren't highlighted here that people would want to see more content on, that's something that we would like feedback on, because that would be good to know, and we could always try to put something else together if there's other topics that are of interest. So with that, I will open it up to questions and stop just talking at a screen. That people would want to see more content on, that's something that
like feedback on, because that would be good to know. We could always try to put something else together if there's other topics that are of interest.
Yeah, Matt, we do have a few questions.
So
So
with that, I will open it up to question.
yeah, Matt, we do have a few questions. If you're ready for me to start, I can do that. So the first set of questions we have are mostly around the hubs. Can you speak a bit more about the hubs, the type of damage assessments that they're looking for from folks, whether it's like a private residence versus, you know, more structural or infrastructure type damage, and then if there can be more information, possibly a future webinar on the hubs. That's the first question.
All right, yeah. We are, you know, that's something we're in the process of kind of working out with our amateur radio group and the hubs in more detail. I think the initial information we would probably be looking to hubs for is general impact information for a neighborhood. You know, are there major access issues to getting to the neighborhood? Are there major utility disruptions? Some idea of level of damage, number of heavily damaged buildings. But if there were ongoing incidents like, you know, active fires or things, we would want that shared at a hub. But I think people just need to know the hub is not necessarily going to be the avenue to get that information to someone to do something. It's more so getting that information to the city so we can incorporate it into kind of overall priorities. In terms of like actual, like this house is on fire, this building is collapsed. In terms of immediate life safety needs, that's likely to be first the fire department identifying it, but it doesn't hurt to share that information anyway that you have. And then on the hub point, I will note that on kind of a hub webinar, they themselves, you know, the hubs are kind of a grassroots group, and they do occasional information sessions on what a hub is and things, but I can talk with leadership of the hubs and see if we could work something into this schedule as well.
Great, thank you. The next question is about transportation accessibility. So streets and bridges. Is there any planning for the ferries and ferry docks? Are there any backup options for transportation accessibility after an earthquake?
I cannot speak specifically to plans with the ferries. I mean, I know that WashDOT and the ferry systems have their own kind of response plans and prioritization. We may be able to speak to that as part of our SDOT webinar, and I can put that down. I can tell you in terms of our personal preparedness messaging, our big thing is, you know, telling people, especially that work in the downtown core, to plan on staying where they're at. You know, it's unlikely that immediately things are going to be up and running. So if you work downtown, but you live out, you know, the peninsula, how are you going to remain self-sufficient in the city? Do you have supplies at work? What is your plan at work? Because it's likely you might have to stay here for a while. But I'll also put this down as kind of something to work into our transportation webinar and see if we can get some state input on ferries as well.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, he really feels like the majority of the population is completely unaware that the expectation is that we need to be sufficient with supplies for up to 2 weeks. So what can we do as the public and as OEM to raise that awareness?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And yes, I agree. And I think it's people are both unaware or I think unmotivated to do something about it. You know, we have done a number of community surveys over the year, and I think surprisingly, it's usually pointed to people are aware of what the biggest risks are and aware of what the impacts are. But then when that translates into them taking some action about it, that's where things usually wane. I think as a person out in the community, I think it's just sharing the information as much as possible, pointing to relevant things going on in the world as much as possible. I think for the most part, it's people's disconnect. They think it won't happen to them. So I think as much as we can highlight when it does happen other places, that it can happen here. I think there's silver linings in things like COVID, and that people at least saw some real impacts in terms of people being isolated and not be able to leave their homes, stores running out of supplies. So I think anytime we can kind of grab onto something like that and show people, look, this is real. Here's things you can actually do about it.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, if you're in an apartment building, are there specific things you can do to be safe? Should you try to stay away from certain things, or if you're able to run, should you, like to the basement garage?
I would say, well, one, it's, we said drop, cover, and hold, and that really is the guidance. I think people's instincts sometimes is to run. You cannot find a good video of someone trying to run in a 9.0 earthquake, because I don't think it's possible, but it's really, if you live in a space like that, thinking now about where the safe space is actually in your unit, because again, in the United States, most injuries are caused by things falling, and actually immediately outside a building is about the worst place you could be. If you look at damage photos from the 2001 Nisqually earthquake, the majority of those were in places with older brick buildings, unreinforced masonry buildings, and mostly what you saw was facades of buildings falling out into the street. So the best thing you can really do is find a safe space, get under something sturdy if you can. If you can't get under something, at least get against an interior wall so that you're away from windows, away from other things that could fall on you. But that really is the best thing you can do. There's some videos out there there were earthquakes in the fall 2 years ago in Mexico City, and you can find videos of people running out of what were pretty modern office buildings and plates of glass falling next to them. So in that case, they're going out into a situation that is much more dangerous than where they were at. So it's really getting under something sturdy, and then, if you need to leave the building because something leads you to believe it's not safe after that, then doing that, but doing it after shaking stops.
Great. So the next question is, I think something we'll definitely cover in future webinars around restoring utilities especially, but somebody mentioned they're a condo owner and their primary concerns are restoration of water, electric, gas, sewage, and the collection of human waste. So if you can just kind of speak to that, and then of course we are going to be speaking to that more on the August 4th Restoring Utilities webinar as well.
Yeah, a couple of things, especially, and they said they lived in a condo, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things on that. We do our training on utility control, and actually our disaster skills workshop that we normally give, and we have some videos that cover this, goes over water storage and purification as well as controlling natural gas. So I think the first thing with water is store water if you can store water. I know in Seattle people are pressed for space. The easiest thing to do, honestly, is just buy some bottles of water, buy a couple of cases of bottled water. We recommend people have a gallon of water per person per day for up to 2 weeks. I will say that is to thrive, not survive. You can obviously get by with a lot less water. That's factoring in water for hygiene, water for drinking, water for cooking. But I would say store what you can so you have some water. Something we go over in our disaster skills workshop is water purification, disinfection, so things like using small amounts of bleach to disinfect water. So having some bleach on hand, so at least if there was water that's coming out that's not potable water, you may be able to disinfect it with small amounts of bleach. If you have a camping stove or something like that, you may be able to boil water. So I think having those things on hand. In terms of other utilities, we go over controlling natural gas. Natural gas leaks are a big risk after fires. Something we talk a lot about in our disaster skills workshop is if you're in an apartment, if you're in a condo, talking to building management about how you access those things. I think the biggest kind of complaint we hear from people is they're in a condo, they're in an apartment building, they don't have access to control utilities, but it's really having that conversation with building management to make them understand, if something happened at 2 in the morning and there's not 24/7 building staff, would residents be able to take action to do some of those things? So utility control, storing water. I had something else there and I don't remember. Oh, sewer. So another thing that we go over in our class, and we have a good video of this on the YouTube channel, is emergency sanitation. So it's very simple guidance on how to have buckets and bags and cat litter or other absorbent material on hand to dispose of human waste. If we don't have water service, we're not going to have sewer service, and dealing with human waste is going to be an issue. So There are some very basic supplies you can have on hand so you can make an emergency toilet, and we do have kind of pretty thorough guidance on that, how you make that emergency toilet, how you dispose of the waste. And that's again where you want to be, and I should have mentioned this more, looking for public information, signed up for Alert Seattle, because that's one of the tools that we'll use to push out information. There will likely be information about specific guidance on getting rid of waste. SPU's kind of take is you may be able to dispose of human waste with normal kind of garbage if we have to do that. But you'd want to kind of look for guidance on that during the situation.
Thank you. So the next question is about the National Guard, Department of Defense. What planning is done around that with FEMA Region 10? What roles would be filled by DoD, and what gaps would we need to fill by FEMA? And if we could talk about Cascadia Rising a bit too.
Yeah, I wish I had Ivan from our office on. You know, we coordinate with the National Guard. There is an element, a role for the Department of Defense and the National Guard, but that's really going to be requested through the state. So, I mean, it's very much a local operation until we make those requests up the chain and they come in. I'm not sure what more I can say about that. I wish I had. I should have more information on that, but
there's a program called Defense Support to Civil Authorities, which is a pretty robust program that the military is used to planning and responding to major disasters. So they don't come in for those medium-sized disasters, but really major disasters. There are tons of mechanisms and plans in place for how that would look and how that would work, but definitely something to flag for future webinars as well. Thank you. The next question is, sorry, one second. Since the Nisqually earthquake, do you think there has been any improvement in areas like cell phone, gas, electrical power backups, small generators, things like that? Nisqually seems like a long time ago. It was.
What was the list of things?
Cell phone, gas station, electrical power backups. I think like cell tower backups, small generators, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to it specifically. And that's a good reminder to me. I think we had communications down as one potential topic for these. I mean, there's definitely been technological advances in those things. A lot of cell providers have pretty robust kind of response programs where they can bring in cell on wheels and things like that. I don't know to what degree those things were in existence in 2001. I mean, they were in existence, but I think there's definitely been advances in that. So there's capabilities to bring things in. Our amateur radio group, actually, that OEM works with, Seattle Auxiliary Communication Services, actually themselves has some, ability to kind of stand up Wi-Fi and things like that. So I mean, I definitely think there has been progress, but it would likely rely on bringing in external resources, which again could be an issue if we're kind of in a catastrophic situation that leaves us isolated.
Great. I'm just reviewing. I think that is all the questions we have. I'm going to also, there were a couple of questions for links. So if you look in the Q&A, if you haven't already, there are links to a few of the common questions we got, especially around Shake Alert. So there's some resources there. And I'll also right now put a link to the future events in our calendar where you can register for updates and reminders about these webinars through our website. So that should be live there now.
And then just on that last question, I was just going to add, I mean, I think they were asking more about specific cellular generator, those things, but that document I mentioned on the kind of major actions the city has taken since Nisqually, there is good information in there on kind of city light and especially Seattle Public Utilities kind of work in terms of Seattle Public Utilities has done a lot of work doing seismic assessments, and then starting to replace sewer and water lines with kind of strengthened, more robust infrastructure that could deal with a major earthquake. So there's good information in that document on the work that's been done there.
And the last question was, several people have asked for the slides. I know we're going to upload the YouTube, or the presentation itself, the video to YouTube with language captions, but people are asking for the slides.
All right, yeah, we can add the slides. I'm thinking we can put them on our website and we'll link to from the YouTube and we'll add them to the website.
We can also include it if you guys aren't signed up for our newsletter. We'll link that in our newsletter once it's available next month, and then yeah, for our June newsletter, and then on our social media platforms as well, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
And I can email, and once we publish, I can email the slides and the link to the YouTube video to everyone that registered. So as long as you registered for this through our calendar on our website and included your email, then you can get it that way.
That's all from me.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining. Again, I encourage you to attend future webinars, and we'll take some of that feedback we got and see about kind of building out the schedule and see if there's other sessions that we could include. So thanks a lot.